This week on the Lectures in History podcast, Vassar College professor Robert Brigham traces how President Franklin D. Roosevelt transformed the United States from an isolationist nation with about 300,000 military personnel in 1939 into a global military power of more than 12 million by 1945. Professor Brigham details the sweeping mobilization efforts that reshaped American society and prepared the nation for its decisive role in World War II. More after this.
Thank you, all of you, for coming out. This is a true war story, which means it's sad, it's true, and it burns in your gut. It's the story, really starts with the Tet Offensive, and it starts with a photographer named Bruce Allen Atwell, who was a Marine combat photographer. He was a career Marine. He was a sergeant when he first got stationed in Vietnam in 1967. And he took some of the most iconic photos from the longest and deadliest urban battle of the entire Vietnam War, the battle for Hue City during the Tet Offensive. And as you probably know, the Tet Offensive was a coordinated communist attack on 64 district and provincial cities all over southern Vietnam. The places that got the headlines, Khe Sanh, Saigon, those were cleaned up relatively quickly. Khe Sanh had a siege for about a month, but the casualties were relatively low. But in Hue City, that was not the story. The Marines at Phu Bai in Company Alpha 11 got word that there were 200 American soldiers in the McVie compound, which was the military headquarters, south of the Perfume River in Hue. And they were surrounded by 200 communist troops. And the order was for this half a company, 147 Mud Marines, to go the 11 kilometers to Hue and to liberate those 200 men from that building. And so off they went. And on the very first tank, there were 5 tanks and some troop trucks. And on the very first tank was Bruce Allen Atwell, the first combat photographer who was in Hue. In fact, he's the only combat photographer who's in Hue for much of the first week of the fighting. And Atwell's photos have appeared everywhere. There's not a book on Vietnam that talks about the Tet Offensive that doesn't have Atwell's photos. If you were to Google, not now, but if you were to Google later, the battle for Hue City, you will see that Atwell's photos are the first thing that pops up. They're in every book that I can think of that deals with the Tet Offensive in any meaningful way. I think there are several reasons why we use Atwell's photos. One, because he's the first there, he's the one with the camera. But two, he's also a career Marine, and he's a sergeant. And most combat photographers in the Marines at this point were privates and corporals. But Atwell had been in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had been the White House photographer for the Marines in 1963. In fact, he took the very last group photo of John F. Kennedy in the White House. And so he had not only Marine experience, he had photography experience by the time he ended up in Vietnam. So his photos have a kind of intimacy that shows that he's a soldier and he knows what battle is going to be like. And he also has a sense of what his Marines, as he called them in his diaries and journals, what his Marines were going through. This is one of his more famous photos. This is from the center of fighting for the first bit of time in Hue is the St. Joan of Arc Chapel and the school across the street. And this is a very famous photo that he took from the school across the street. And I remember the first time I saw this photo, I thought, this Marine is a bit reckless. Because to get that photo, he's clearly in harm's way. We have benefited from his storytelling about what that must have been like, but I still think he was in harm's way. Let me tell you a little bit about the story that brought Atwell to the St. Joan of Arc School. So the word went out for these 147 Mud Marines to go north to Hue to rescue these 200. They came to a canal that's just south of the Perfume River, and at that canal they experienced heavy mortar fire. The first person that was hit off a tank fell off the tank almost rolled over him, then he got hit again, and a sergeant named John Canley pulled this Marine into a nearby house, realized that his wounds were fatal, wrapped him in a poncho, and put him back on the truck that had just dropped off the troops and was heading back because people were dying fast already at that very first interaction. When that young man got back to, on the morgue truck, got back to Fubai to the morgue, corpsmen took him off. He moved inside his poncho. They said, we have a live one here, and Canley saved his life, and as a result, earned a Medal of Honor. That person is actually a neighbor of Vassar College. His name's Pat Fraley. He's still alive, and my students interview him in classes regularly. But Pat was the first of what would become several casualties, because even though intelligence said there were 200 communist troops surrounding McAfee headquarters, within a few short hours, that number was adjusted to 10,000. So these 147 Mud Marines are facing 10,000 very well-trained, mostly PAVN troops, disciplined, entrenched, with the latest firepower. It's going to take a while for that company, Alpha 11, to get reinforcements. They couldn't have air cover because the weather was too bad. So for a long time, this 147 had to take it all on. This, I remember this photo. This is a photo from the St. Joan of Arc Church, a young Marine. This photo, I first came in contact with it in September of 1978. I wrote my very first college paper on this photo. I had a labor historian who was teaching the Vietnam War, which was obviously relatively fresh in everyone's memory. We had a lot of veterans in class. And our professor was really interested in the aspect of this is a working class war and these working class kids. And so he handed out photos and wanted us to find out everything we could about the context for the photo. So I became kind of a way city battle junkie writing this first paper. And I remember thinking that this young Marine didn't look that much older than I was in college, and what he must have, by this time he knew what the odds were. There are only going to be 7 people who walk out of here, out of those 147. And I think you can see that in this young Marine as he peers out this chapel. The high command was very reluctant to, once the weather cleared, was very reluctant to bomb Hue City, because the entire city is eventually going to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's the home of the Nguyen Dynasty. It's the home of Vietnam's version of a forbidden city, the Purple City. It has its ancient citadel there. It is a historic site, but the only way that they were going to rescue their Marines, save the Marines, was to bomb. And so this is that same chapel, St. Joan of Arc's chapel. And you can see the 4 Marines coming down the steps. There are 2 Medal of Honor winners among those 4 Marines. That's how bad the fighting was. Right? And one of them was awarded posthumously. And for 30 days, this was what the fighting was like in Hue. It was hand to hand, house to house, and sometimes floor to floor. So PAVN would be on the 3rd floor and the Marines would be on the 2nd floor. And it was, the Marines were not trained for this kind of fighting in Vietnam. There had been some urban warfare in Korea, but nobody in Hue had any command experience or combat experience in that urban environment. And the way the city was set up with walls and gardens, it meant that anytime you stepped out into a street, you were subject to mortar fire. And so you often had to blow through walls, not go around them, because you would expose yourself. So this is really another famous photo of Bruce Allen Atwell, is showing the Marines going through this slog of going through this wall, liberating that floor, going through that wall. It's a long slog, and much of our cultural production about Vietnam comes from this moment. Full Metal Jacket, Michael Herr's Dispatches, a lot of movies and a lot of books are about Hue. A week after this is when the rest of the world shows up in Way. Walter Cronkite, Michael Hare, Catherine Leroy, the famous combat photographers. But during this first week, it's Atwell and his little 35 millimeter camera and his grease gun. Again, there's just something about his photos that are so capturing. This is a 106 recoilless rifle being positioned to take out a machine gun, a Pavan machine gun. And I love this picture. I love this picture not only because these are Marines that are in a situation that's desperate, but I just think this picture says an awful lot about who's there, who's fighting, and why they think they should keep going. They are going to get beat to the draw, and Atwell's capturing this. There's about 20 photos in this sequence, and the very last photo is just before they get hit, and then Atwell himself. I was right, he was reckless. And as you can read in the caption, it says he was wounded, but he kept shooting his film until he cared for his fellow Marines. The person in the front of that photo, it went on to become, he had very severe wounds. 3 of those other Marines were killed. And the one with the tall guy in the front with the very severe wounds went on to become the president of the VFWs. Atwell is not your typical Marine combat photographer. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was one of 17 children. His father had lost much of his right hand in the Battle of the Bulge in the Second World War, and had come home to North Adams, Massachusetts, a real working class town if ever there was one. It had the 4th highest unemployment rate in the country. And it was a factory town, and with one hand, he really wasn't going to get much work in the factories. His father had worked in the factories, but there wasn't much for him. And so he kind of crawled inside a bottle and wasn't a good caretaker for those 17 children. And so eventually, Atwell's mother took them to her sisters in neighboring New York State in Washington County, which is bordering Vermont, and tried to make a go of it. Before they left, they lived in abandoned houses. They scavenged for food, figuring out which berries you could eat. They hunted rabbit and deer, and they literally lived hand to mouth. In the winters, they burned the doors off of other abandoned buildings for heat. And finally, she just couldn't keep them together anymore, so she took this crew to her sisters in Washington County, New York. After 6 months, she gave up, and she called New York State Social Services and put the kids in foster care. This is a picture of Atwell actually after foster care, because they first went in 1951. I think his smile and his enthusiasm are evident, as is his charisma, but I think he's hiding an awful lot of pain. All of his brothers and sisters were raped in foster care. Foster care in New York, in rural New York in the 1950s, was a euphemism for free farm labor. And he was no exception. These are the Atwell children, all of them ending up in foster care. They ranged in age from 1 year to 17. This is a sheet of Atwell's stay in foster care. As you can see, it's quite elaborate. You would generally move every 2 years. His very first stay in foster care was in a hospital because his new foster parents realized that he was so malnourished he couldn't stand up. And if you can't stand up, you can't do farm chores. He persisted, he moved around, he did get some village life. He lived in a small village of 1,800 people in New York, on the border with Vermont, called Cambridge, New York. And there he had a brief respite from the rigor of farm life, but it was still foster care, and he had another 2 or 3 foster stops. In August of 1959, New York State Social Services lost contact with his mother. And in the 1950s in New York State, foster care was dependent upon the right to return. You had to be able to stay in foster care. You had to have the promise of returning your children to their home. And once that promise is broken, you're out of foster care and you're institutionalized. In August of 1959, New York State Social Services lost contact with Atwell's mother. What he didn't know, what my research on him divulged, was that she had remarried, divorced her husband, and had remarried her brother-in-law, and had moved to California. And her brother-in-law had 5 or 6 children of his own, and then they had more children together, and her ex-husband remarried a woman who had several children, and they had children of their own. So if you stretch this line out from the original 17, it gets in the high 20s very quickly. What Atwell also didn't know was that all the rest of the kids that were in foster care made their way back to their mom, and most of them were in California with her. He's the only one that was left behind. And I think he sensed that. He didn't know it, but I think he sensed that from his writings. He always was going to carry a grudge against his mother from that. He's institutionalized in August of 1959 at Vanderhayden Hall in Troy, New York. And its former name was the Troy Orphan Asylum. And right next to his signature, when they sign him in, it says abandoned. And he took that with him and he internalized it. In 10th grade, he dropped out of high school and he joined the Marines as a 17-year-old independent young man. Now, most combat photographers, all the ones I've interviewed, had some college-level training or some kind of training that got them to be able to do the chemistry. Atwell's brothers and sisters told me they never thought he even held a camera in his life before he joined the Marines. He certainly didn't own one. So the one mystery I have in researching the story is he joined the Marines in May of 1962 and he's in Cuba as a photographer in October of 1962. How did that happen? I don't know. His DD-214, his official record in the military, shows that he went to the Marine Army photography school in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, but that was in 1965. So now I understand, and those of you in the service are nodding, that DD-214s are notorious for being inaccurate. But I've checked with everybody who knew Atwell, and they said, yes, that is when he was there. So he was a photographer first, and then went to school to become a photographer. I guess there's a certain military logic in all of that. And he dies young. Like many people in Atwell's family, he has horrific heart disease. He's wounded, as you know. In Way, he comes back to North Carolina. He married a woman. When he got back from Cuba, somebody set him up on a blind date with a woman from Salisbury, North Carolina. And they got married and they had 3 children together. And then they divorced and he remarried someone else. And he lived in Salisbury, North Carolina. He became an engineer for the Norfolk Southern Railroad. Again, I've interviewed everybody I can find that worked with him in the Norfolk Southern. He had no experience, but overnight he became an engineer. I can't follow this guy. I just can't follow him. But there is horrific heart disease in his family. He died at 61. His father died at 53. His grandfather died at 43. All but 1 or 2 of his brothers and sisters died in their 50s and 60s from heart disease. I'm sure that the poverty had a lot to do with that, and I don't think getting shot in Vietnam helped. What he didn't know at the time of his death was he had a son, Kevin.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
In August of 1959, when he was institutionalized at Vanderhayden Hall, he had been having sex with an older woman. He was 13, she was 22. And he was in foster care on one farm, and she lived in the neighboring farm, and she would come to the farm where he was in foster care to clean house to make extra money. And she got pregnant, and he left August 2nd of 1959, and she didn't realize that she was pregnant until the end of August. But by that time, he was already whisked away. They never spoke to each other again. He had no idea that he had a son named Kevin. None. Kevin's mom, clearly upset about the age difference, told no one that she was pregnant. She hopped a bus and went to Buffalo, New York, to a Salvation Army home for unwed mothers, and she gave Kevin up for adoption, never to see him again. Kevin spent his time in foster care, and I should tell you that if your parent is in foster care, the likelihood that you're going to end up in foster care is about 82%. And so Kevin followed his father through the foster care system, had a bout where he was homeless, another foster care arrangement, but eventually he got adopted, and ironically ended up in the same town where his father had spent some of his foster care time. Kevin and his father had the same social worker. Can't make this stuff up. No idea. He had no idea. After Kevin is adopted, his new family, the new parents divorced almost immediately. Kevin had a tough go. So a social worker, the same social worker for Bruce Allen Atwell, showed up at his house in September of 1967 with his single mom now, and she whispered the word Vietnam. And like all adoptees, Kevin wanted to fit in, so he told a story. And the story that he told, with absolutely zero knowledge, was that his father was in Vietnam, his biological father, and that's why his family wasn't whole. That's why he was living with this new family. And it was a story he told himself, and changed the details year to year as the likelihood of his father being in Vietnam grew less and less, because where was he? Why wasn't he coming back to find Kevin? And then eventually Kevin changed the story in his head to that his father was a POW, and then that his father had died in Vietnam. And Kevin led with that story everywhere he went in the world. It defined who he was when he had no history of his own, and it became an obsession of finding this Vietnam dad and learning all that he could about the Vietnam War. He wrote the Department of Defense as a 13-year-old boy, asking them for the list of all the dead from New York State. And then, even with very bad dyslexia, he got some friends to help him write letters to all the parents of those who had died. And he was just asking a simple question: is it possible that I'm your grandson? I think my father died in Vietnam. And he was overwhelmed by the response. Most of the people answered. And most of the people, the dead in New York, at 15 names a page, is 235 pages long from the Vietnam War, front and back, right? And that was Kevin's first foray into the Vietnam War in a serious way. And he developed lifelong relationships with those parents who had lost someone in Vietnam. They became kind of an extended family for Kevin. He never knew Bruce Atwell. Never got to meet him. But he did get to study his war. And last week, Kevin was in Vietnam with this new knowledge because a DNA test brought him to his father that he never knew. And so for the first time, armed with that knowledge, Kevin returned to Vietnam and he retraced his father's footsteps. I am Kevin. I'll let that sit for a minute. Yeah. I'd love to take questions because there's some holes in this story. Questions? Don't be bashful. I've just told you my whole life story. Don't be bashful.
Thank you for being willing to share that. That was a very moving story. Were you ever able to find anything about your mother or anything in her life beyond?
Yes. When I was 10, I overheard a babysitter say that my mother had died of cancer shortly after giving me birth. And I should say that my new mom was terrific in all of this. She understood my desire to have a history. She knew that didn't mean I loved her any less. She and my father did great by me. They did the best they could by me. And when I thought that this had happened, my new mom went to every graveyard in Washington County. And we looked at every cemetery for a girl that was 16 that died of supposedly cancer shortly after giving me birth. We did this for 4 years, and we found nobody that matched that. When I was 40 and moving that same mother out of my childhood home, I found my sealed adoption papers that nobody is supposed to ever be able to see. I found them in a chest of drawers in her bedroom. It had my biological mother's name, her address, and some background information that let me know that she drove by me to work a lot. So I reached out to that family, and it was a bit of a shock for them. I thought we had good footing for a minute, and then they ghosted me. I do have a relationship with a sibling after my mother gave me up. She got pregnant by someone else and had a baby. I have an online relationship with her, and there's another person on that side of the family that doesn't know this story. Will now. And when the book comes out literally a year from today, called This Is a True War Story, if you're so inclined. So I found that side of the family, but they were not. The Atwell side, I have 100 first cousins in the state of Massachusetts alone. My Christmas card list is just horrific. And they couldn't wait to get together, and there's not enough of me to go around. And they have welcomed me. I have brothers and sisters. I'm a New Yorker, as you know. I have a brother that was born in North Carolina that looks just like me, but he's the southern version. That's a little freaky, right? To be 60 years old and staring at yourself, and yeah. So, yeah, we've developed that out quite a bit. Yeah.
I'm not apologizing because of my accent.
I can hear you just fine.
But I want you to know that in 1967, I graduated from the Buffalo Academy of the Sacred Heart. And I remember that we had to write to all the Vietnam veterans that were there. And I don't know, I just have a picture. And also, I like to state that all of us had a tear in our eyes and my spine just chilled with your story. Not only have you become the picture of your dad, but that is written forever wherever you go. I hope you go to Quito
Thank you.
and the Galapagos.
Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Richard Brigham, and I'm actually a conflict archaeologist. I study battlefield archaeology. And just as an archaeologist, well, first of all, wow. Second of all, please tell me about what happened in Vietnam with you, with your trip.
Yeah, so my wife and I, for a long time, have led Vassar College alumni trips to Vietnam. And before we had a child, we actually took 44 Vassar students to Vietnam, which if you're a parent, you know better. But I wasn't at that point, so I was naive and didn't know what I didn't know. Yeah, this trip was emotional. I was very lucky that the 30 alums that were on this trip were people that I knew. And I felt it was curated, and we invited the people who had known my story a little bit. And so we went, and we were in Hanoi for a bit, and I was knowing what the next stop was, and nobody on the trip really knew the story. They knew that there was some connection. And so we pulled up to the church, St. Joan of Arc's church, and we had a Vietnamese tour guide with us, and he hopped out because the person who's the caretaker of the church, who he hadn't seen in 20 years, was his catechism teacher in Hue. So he jumped out, and he went and talked to him, and then called me over, and this caretaker said they get about 500 visitors a week to the church, which is completely restored. A lot of American veterans helped rebuild the church, and the church is completely restored, but he said everybody wants to know about the Battle of Hue City, because it is the stuff of legend, and you watch Full Metal Jacket, and there you have it. So he said, he gets a lot of American visitors, and so he said, I have these photos that I show people who come through to show them how devastating the war is here. And he opened up his phone, and he's showing me my father's photos. And I've been able to hold it together. I discovered this 6 years ago, and I've given talks here or there. The book's coming out. There's going to be a short limited series coming out on this as well, and I've been able to hold it together, but I couldn't hold it together after that. That was just the kind of validation that I hadn't expected, that the journey was kind of coming full circle. And it was wonderful to see that my father, even in his death, is still telling the story of what happened there, so that we don't forget it. It's just a very powerful. I like to eat. I even skipped dinner that night. Right? That's how bad. This might be a good time just to take a 2-second and say, when I made this discovery, it was right before COVID, and so I had all of these aunts and uncles who only lived 2 hours away, and I couldn't see them, and they were dying one by one. And in fact, the very first person that I had the DNA match with was a cousin, and her husband handled her ancestry account, and he died in March 2020 from COVID. So I was, and being 60 years old and having literally spent my entire life, having devoted my entire professional career to this very personal thing, and then getting it and not being able to do anything about it, it was devastating emotionally. And there were a group of people who got me through that.
Can you hear me? So I'm also adopted, so your story actually resonates with me. And my grandfather was a World War II vet, and I really do want to do like the tracing the path, because you actually went a lot of places. And so I was curious, like being able to take the journey to Vietnam and tying up all your loose ends, have you gotten your closure?
No. I would love to say yes, but no. You know, there's a lot about adoption. I mean, I feel extremely lucky that I was adopted by people who love me. We had no money, we had no this, we had no that, but they loved me. They really loved me. They did. They poured time into me, which was better than money. But still, there's an awful lot about the system. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was sealed adoptions for the adoptee are really problematic. I had an adoptive sister, and she died at age 49 of a very rare melanoma. And I found out after her death, when I did some digging, now that I knew what was going on, she had a different mother, obviously, and a different father, and her mother had died at age 49 of the same rare melanoma. And if her records hadn't been sealed, if her medical records hadn't been sealed, there were things that could have been done. And so I don't think you know, if that's your history, I didn't know I had this. I mean, I always had a health tick, and we were watching it. But if some doctor had told me at 21, look, your life expectancy in your family's 50 years old, I would have made some changes. Even though I lived pretty squeaky clean, I still would have made some changes. Chicken fried steak tomorrow. But so I think that if you're an adoptee, there's never going to be closure. But what you can do is, for me at least, this journey has allowed me to get to a place where I can be joyous and be grateful and be thankful for everything that has happened, even if it's not going to close that particular.
It's all for a reason.
Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Thank you for your story, because I know how hard it must be to stand up there.
It is very hard.
On the edge of my 80th birthday, I went through the Tet Offensive. And I was very fortunate. I worked on airplanes. I was not an 0311, I wasn't a grunt. But I think the hardest part of coming back was living with the guilt that I didn't get hurt, I didn't get killed. And I was listening to your story, I'm thinking about a bunkmate who was in the Marine Corps because he aged out of Family Protective Services and had absolutely no family.
Yeah, the pipeline from foster care to the armed services is real. It's no joke. I think we can do better with, not that that's not a great place to end up for some people, but you ought to, when you're 17, you ought to have some options. And it's very clear from my father's journals and diaries that he had felt totally abandoned by his mother. She abandoned him, so he should feel abandoned. And I, to this day, don't know why he was the one. He was 14 when she left. And he had older brothers and sisters that she found and took with her to California. So that was always, I guess this gets back to your question. I can't have closure because he's never going to get closure on his thing. And I feel incredibly connected to him. I can't tell you in words how good it felt when I first found my mother's information to be able to put a pin on a map where my people were from, right? They're from the Shetland Islands. That made so much, doesn't it make sense, right? Makes so much sense for who I am, right? This little rocky outcrop in the middle of bad weather in the middle of the ocean. Yeah, that's me. I love that. And now, I'm the son of a Marine, and that really means something to me. I was a son of a Vietnam veteran, and we're both storytellers in our own way of his war. I take that as a sense of pride, but also with an enormous sense of responsibility.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Which is why I'm here.
I have another question. All right, I'm walking around here like Sam distance. Great that you're from the Shetlands. I actually finishing my PhD at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, so in that same nasty turf. I'm incredibly excited to read your book when it comes out.
Please do, all of you.
I'm going to make sure that I find out when this book comes out.
Yep.
But another question I have is, I want to know what questions do you have, if you're able to share, that you haven't gotten answered through your book? I'm sure you have them, but is there any that you're willing to share with us?
Oh, I have a million questions. Some of them about my grandparents. Why any of it? Why 17 kids? Why leave my dad? Why not? He went to California in 1971 to try to reconcile with his mother, and it didn't go well. But she didn't really reach out ever to him. Neither did my grandfather, and so I have a lot of the questions that we all have about our families. That's the one thing that's universal, right? Which is why this story probably resonates the way it does. I have family questions. I have unknown sisters, 2 of them out there. I'd love to know who they were. I think one of them was put up for adoption. I wonder if she feels the same way about adoption that I do. I wonder if she needs a brother. That's the other thing that happened overnight. So when all this discovery was going on, my adoptive father had died, my adoptive mother was going to die, my adoptive sister was dead, it was just me. And then I got this DNA test, and then it wasn't just me. It was this tribe of Atwells. And of those 100 and something cousins, I'm the oldest. Of the now 9 brothers and sisters, I'm the oldest. All right, so what do I all right, so where do I fit in here? All my memories are with Brigham, Bradfords, and McGraths. All my biology is over here, and some of my siblings need a big brother. Am I the big brother? Can I do that? There's family questions, right? But from a historical sense, I probably know Bruce Atwell better than most people know their parents. Because I'm telling you, I noodled this thing. I nerded out on Vietnam in a way that isn't really healthy, quite frankly. If you had asked 7-year-old me what I was going to be doing, I would say, on a beautiful April day, I'm going to be talking to lovely people at the Schmidt Symposium at TCU. This is what I was going to do with my life. I was absolutely determined that this is what I was going to do. So I don't have any questions on the the nuts and bolts of it. I got it, except the camera business. Where did he learn photography? I still, to this day, that baffles me. We done? Okay.
Oh, wait.
I got one.
One more.
Some more?
Oh, your entire story is pretty incredible, but the most incredible part, how can a woman have 17 children, remarry and have more children, and still be upright? What does she look like? You got a picture of her? I'd like to see her.
I don't have a picture of her, but I can say to you the Atwells were a pretty hardy bunch. Yeah, they're healthy. And hardy, except for the heart disease. They're healthy and hardy. Yeah, it gets confusing. I have gone to 1 or 2 family reunions. Now you got to follow this, right? Because cousins become stepbrothers and stepsisters. And so when I get Facebook friend requests, I hide because I can't figure out this person is my cousin, but they're it's impossible. I mean, I have a team of research assistants. We're trying to put a flow chart together for this book's being published by the University of Chicago Press, and they asked for a family tree. You're going to kill a forest, it's just not fair. So we literally gave up on it because it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Well, thank you all for coming here tonight. One more? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it took me a while, Hi, everyone. My name's Eric Friedman. I actually served with Lance Corporal Benjamin Schmidt, and your story today really resonated. I have 3 young children at home, and I joined the Marine Corps in 2007, and I didn't know my biological father either. And I was running away and just thought, deploying to Afghanistan as an infantry Marine was going to be my escape, my reality, and make a name for myself. And your story has really resonated with me as, is it worth the step on looking for your dad? Is it worth, trying to find him?
Yes, and I'll help you. Okay. I mean that. Get in touch with me, and I will help you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.